The slave trade of Slavic people. Impact, routes, and cross-cultural connections. Historical context and broader picture. The Middle Ages were a time of significant transformation, where civilizations, empires, and cultures interacted in complex ways, often through trade. Between the 7th and 11th centuries, one of the most valuable and contested commodities along the trade routes crossing Eastern Europe was not gold or spices, but people, Slavic slaves. Picture a quiet Slavic village, surrounded by thick forests and fertile fields, where families lived harmoniously with nature. But this peace was constantly under threat from invaders, mainly Vikings, but also Khazar and Arab traders, who would capture and enslave whoever they could find. This wasn't a rare occurrence. In fact, it was part of a vast global trade network that linked Scandinavia, the Middle East, Constantinople, and the Caspian Sea. The trade of Slavic slaves played a critical role in the global economy of the time, driving the demands of growing empires like the Byzantine and Abbasid, and deeply impacting Slavic communities both socially and politically. In this video, we'll explore how this trade shaped the lives of Slavic people, the major trade routes used by slave traders, and how various cultures contributed to this commerce. We'll also take a closer look at the fate of those enslaved and how this vast network of human trafficking influenced the politics and economies of the era. The experience of the enslaved, voices silenced. Let's imagine the story of a Slavic family living peacefully along the banks of a river. One morning, Viking raiders storm their village. The family is torn apart. The father is taken to row Viking ships, while the mother and children are dragged south to be sold in slave markets. While this family story is fictional, it reflects the experience of thousands of Slavs captured and sold into slavery during this period. The conditions during transport were brutal. Many enslaved people were forced to march for weeks, even months, in chain groups, enduring hunger, disease, and physical abuse. For women and children, the situation was often even worse. Many were sent to harems or sold as domestic servants in the homes of the wealthy. Men, on the other hand, were often forced into labor, becoming soldiers, manual laborers, or rowers on merchant ships. However, even amid this oppression, there were forms of resistance. Some managed to escape, while others kept their cultural and religious traditions alive, passing down stories and folklore to future generations. This resilience speaks to the strength of those who have hardened such a cruel system. To dive deeper into this discussion, we must also consider the psychological and social effects of slavery. Being returned from one's homeland and separated from family was an immense trauma, one that affected entire generations. Whole communities were destabilized, and the legacy of Slavic slavery left a lasting imprint on their cultural memory. Trade routes and geography. The logistics of the slave trade. The trade of Slavic slaves was facilitated by an extensive network of routes that crisscrossed Eastern Europe. Rivers, especially the Dnieper and Volga, played a crucial role, acting as liquid highways that connected Slavic lands to the Black and Caspian Seas. Viking, Arab, and Khazar merchants used these waterways to transport enslaved people to major trading centers like Constantinople, Baghdad, and Samarkand. Cities like Kiev and Constantinople were key hubs in this trade. Constantinople, in particular, became one of the largest slave markets of the time, where enslaved individuals were sold to work in palaces, serve as soldiers, or labor in the fields. However, these trade routes were not without danger. Merchants had to contend with harsh weather, bandits, pirates who prowled the rivers, and the constant challenge of controlling groups of enslaved people during long journeys. However, the profits from the slave trade were so substantial that many merchants became extremely wealthy despite the risks. Besides the rivers, overland routes also played a key role, linking northern Europe to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Jewish Radhanite merchants, for example, were vital intermediaries, bridging the Christian West and the Islamic East. They controlled routes that passed through Christian, Muslim, and pagan territories, ensuring a steady flow of slaves and other valuable goods. Compared to other human trafficking routes of the time, like the trans-Saharan slave trade or Mediterranean routes, the Slavic slave trade was more directly influenced by river geography, whereas others relied on caravans crossing deserts or mountains. This connection to rivers and seas made the Slavic slave trade on. That is, shaping not only the routes, but also the social and economic dynamics of the regions involved. The role of different cultures, cross-cultural connections, and power dynamics, the trade in Slavic slaves involved a wide range of players, each playing a distinct role in this complex network. The Vikings, or Norsemen, were the primary captors. They raided Slavic villages, captured the inhabitants, and then transported them south to be sold to Arab, Byzantine, and Khazar merchants. The Khazars, a semi-nomadic civilization controlling the area between the Caspian and Black Seas, also played a pivotal role in the slave trade. Positioned strategically between Europe and the Middle East, the Khazars controlled key trade routes and acted as intermediaries in the transport of slaves. The Byzantines, in turn, were massive consumers of slaves. Constantinople was a bustling slave market, where people from various backgrounds were sold to serve as soldiers, forced laborers, or domestic servants. The slave trade was essential to sustaining the Byzantine economy and supplying manpower for its military forces. In the Islamic world, enslaved Slavs, known as Sakalaba, were highly valued for their physical strength and adaptability. Many of them were trained as elite soldiers and served in Islamic armies, especially in the Abbasid Caliphate. Some even rose to power, becoming Mamluks, an elite military class that would eventually control entire dynasties in Egypt and Syria. These cultural and commercial interactions between different civilizations created a multicultural trade network that deeply affected the political and economic relationships of the time. Alliances and rivalries between Byzantines, Arabs, and Khazars shaped the routes and the flow of slaves, influencing not just economies, but also diplomacy and military conflicts throughout the region. The demand in the Islamic world and the fate of the enslaved. The demand for slaves in the Islamic world was particularly high due to the need for labor in domestic, military, and agricultural settings. Slavic slaves, or Sakalaba, were especially prized in the Abbasid Caliphate, where many were trained as elite warriors. Women enslaved during this time were often sent to harems, where they lived in confinement, serving as concubines or domestic servants. Life in the harems was marked by subjugation and a lack of freedom, with little hope of release. Many in the Islamic world justified the practice of slavery with religious arguments. Non-Muslims, referred to as infidels, could be enslaved under Islamic law. While there were specific regulations that governed the treatment of slaves, providing some limited protections, the trade thrived and created a massive demand for enslaved people from Slavic and other backgrounds. Impact on Slavic communities, social and political shifts. The slave trade had a devastating impact on Slavic communities. The loss of large portions of their population to the slave trade destabilized many villages and regions, weakening social cohesion and forcing these communities to reorganize their political and military structures to resist Viking and other slave raiders. In response to the constant threat of capture, some Slavic kingdoms began to militarize. The Kingdom of Bohemia, under the Pre-Mislid dynasty, was one such region that consolidated its power to counter the raids and the growing slave trade. This centralization of authority laid the groundwork for the emergence of stronger Slavic nations in the centuries that followed. Culturally, the impact of slavery left a lasting imprint. The constant threat of being captured and sold into far-off lands shaped Slavic folklore and religious traditions. Spiritual beliefs, rituals, and legends helped these communities maintain their identity during times of great adversity. Reflections and lasting legacy. The trade of Slavic slaves was a complex global network that linked different cultures, empires, and economies. The marks left by this practice are deep and long-lasting, affecting not only the Slavic communities but also the Islamic world and Europe as a whole. Although slavery is widely condemned today, the legacy of this trade still echoes across different parts of the world. The lessons of resistance, oppression, and survival that emerge from this history continue to teach us about the resilience of the human spirit. By reflecting on the Slavic slave trade, we gain a better understanding of the forces that shaped the medieval world and how multicultural connections, even when based on exploitation, helped build the foundations of the modern world.